Coming up on this episode of the Roundtable.
One does not simply screenshot and post or sell or shop private chats. It simply must not be done. Once you cross that Rubicon, you have done something that transcends Machiavellianism, that transcends opportunism, that crosses over, I, for one, will say, into the demonic. This is really bad stuff. This is like secret police, wet dream material. And once you cross that Rubicon, there is no going back.
Hello and welcome once again to the Roundtable, your weekly publishers and editors podcast here at the American Mind. I'm your host, Spencer Clavin, features editor of the American Mind and associate editor of the Claremont Review of Books. I'm joined today by editor James Poulos and managing editor Seth Barron. First thing on the agenda to talk about today is the terrifying new trend, the shadow sweeping across the nation, the rise of fascism right here in the US. You didn't think it could happen, but oh yes, it can. Not only are people lifting weights and trying to live healthily, sure sign of far-right extremism, they are also gathering together in local communities and protesting the display of sexually explicit materials in elementary schools, like the fascists they are. I'm talking, of course, about Moms for Liberty. This is a nationwide organization, nonprofit, that started during the pandemic, 2021. They kind of started getting together initially to end or lobby to end school closures. So a red-coded group already, but now as part of the raised awareness, increasing alarm about so-called sex ed, but more properly grooming in elementary schools and public schools, they've turned their attention more broadly to parental rights. This is a subject that we care about on this show, and at the American Mind, we've talked about it before, and Moms for Liberty have been kind of a major group at the forefront of this series of controversies. Lately, it seems it's difficult to tell here. You guys can talk with me about which came first, the chicken or the egg. It's difficult to tell whether the press decided and the left decided to kind of launch a campaign against them, and then they dug up this Hitler quote scandal, which we're going to get into, or whether the Hitler quote scandal occasioned sort of further cascade of attention paid to Moms for Liberty in the press. But just recently, they've been kind of the left's favorite hate object. They were designated an extremist group by the Southern Poverty Law Center, famous for being a pot and calling the kettle black. And one of their chapters in Hamilton County, Indiana, has come under scrutiny because in their newsletter, they quoted Hitler. Now, the quote is as follows: "He alone who owns the youth gains the future." This, according to Moms for Liberty, and in my view, quite plausibly, this was a quote designed to raise alarm. This is not the first time this quote has ever been used, and obviously, and nobody is out here thinking like, yeah, that's great that Hitler wanted to own the youth. Like, let's all jump behind the Hitler Youth and recreate that. Obviously, as they later clarified, this is a quote that's supposed to make people alarmed because the government control over childhood education, and especially a kind of hostile psychosexual manipulation on the part of the government and its adjacent organs. Very, very bad, not ideal, and certainly a mode of social control. But of course, Moms for Liberty has had to walk this back, has been kind of harangued as obviously what they were clearly doing here is quoting their dear Fuhrer to advocate the creation of a new Hitler Youth 2.0. Paige Miller, chapter chairwoman, says we should not have quoted him in our newsletter and express our deepest apology. This all kind of reminds me of when the Obama administration was going after the Little Sisters for the Poor. It's just like not a good look, bruh, to be browbeating these obviously darling mothers with this kind of mama bear energy that they're afraid that their kids are getting, rightly concerned that their kids are getting preached to by people that don't have their best interests at heart, that want to conscript them into twisted and perverse psychosexual ideology. What do you guys make of all this? Is this a sign that Moms for Liberty was making headway? Is there? I mean, I hesitate to give credence to any of this. Is there anything to the, like, did they make a misstep of some kind here? Or are we really just looking at a kind of manufactured 2 minutes hate against a group that is dangerous because it sees what's going on?
I would say that it is manufactured, but it's also a misstep, because anything you do that, like, attracts the gaze of the media, the left media, and if they can, gin up a story, gin up a narrative, and then just repeat it and repeat it, well, then you're kind of screwed. I don't think the sort of people who hear this are going to think, oh, gee, these are just some like nice moms.
Yeah.
They're going to think, oh, these are Christian militant lunatics who actually really like Hitler. What I think is really funny about this is the idea that quoting Hitler in any context is reprehensible.
Yeah.
Because the left quotes Hitler all the time. The whole idea of the big lie, which the left constantly accused Trump, for instance, of employing, comes straight out of Mein Kampf. Hitler described the big lie. I mean, the left describes the big lie as repeating a falsehood enough so that nobody knows if it's true or not. Now, it's true that Hitler described this technique in Mein Kampf, but he didn't say this is something that he wants to do. He said this is what the Jews do. This is how the Jews promote their falsehoods. So I think it's kind of ironic then that the left media picked this up as something to blame Trump for it. So it just seems kind of like an ironic, I don't know, doubly ironic gesture on their part. But so, why are they allowed to quote Hitler all the time? It just occurred to me in Maus, the graphic novel that, because some school took it off the reading list or replaced it with something else in a syllabus, it's now shot to the top of the banned books charts, even though it's not banned at all. But as I recall, the epigraph to Maus is a quote from Hitler saying, the Jews are certainly a race, but they are definitely not human. Well, is Art Spiegelman praising Hitler? Is he saying that the Jews are not human? Well, no. Neither are the Moms for Liberty. However, you've got Gavin Newsom just out there every day tweeting about how the Moms for Liberty is this Hitlerite group.
Yeah, this is sort of reminds me of how, like, even if you say the N-word in a quotation as part of illustrating that it's bad to say that word, you will sometimes draw serious criticism and perhaps even suffer consequences, even for saying words that sound like the N-words. Like, I'm thinking about this guy, David Howard, who was an aide to the mayor of Washington. He talked about a budget using a word that sounded like the N-word. And this was like, led to his resignation. Anyway, just the whole notion that even touching these thoughts, just to examine them under a kind of spotlight or under a microscope, that too, if you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, that brings condemnation. And it makes me wonder whether it's worth trying to avoid, since, you're damned if you do, damned if you don't. I mean, there's probably, a more polished, media savvy organization would probably have looked at this newsletter and said, oh, yes, our enemies are going to, even though we obviously don't mean this, our enemies are going to paint us as like Hitler stands. But the other thing about it that kind of gets me here is he alone who owns the youth does gain the future. This is a basic fact of political reality that has been stated and recognized by any number of people besides Adolf Hitler, that the left understands intimately. It's why they made the long march through the institutions. And so it's like, Hitler also wore shoes. Like, there are all sorts of things about Hitler that that neither were kind of bound up inextricably with his anti-Semitism. And indeed, the truth of them enabled his anti-Semitism, which is part of the point that they're making. They're saying this is a fact. Hitler recognized it too, and that's how he was able to do this evil, dastardly thing. So we better get wise to it as well, in defense of what we believe to be the righteous cause and the good thing. All of that could have been more clearly spelled out, granted. But the key point is the one that you're saying, Seth, which is like, it doesn't matter really. It's you're the wrong person noticing the wrong thing at the wrong time.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. In a totally unrelated tweet, Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader of the House and the nephew of Leonard Jeffries, noted anti-Semite and black supremacist, but Hakeem Jeffries tweeted out, oh, he was talking about how the extreme MAGA Republicans are trying to roll everything back. But he said, our victory is inevitable. Now, it occurred to me, like, that would be like a very good translation of Sieg Heil. So why isn't he? I mean, can't he be said to be quoting Hitler? Kind of.
And lo, we are all quoting Hitler now. Look, I mean, this is a manifest absurdity. We know it. They know it. Gavin Newsom knows it. It is all a pretend act of political life. Has real world consequences. But I think now is the time to lean into the absurdity until it breaks. They did make a big mistake, actually. Their mistake was not attributing the quote to literally Hitler. If they had simply put the words, M dash literally Hitler, none of this would be happening. So, take note, folks. If you lean into the absurdity, it will protect you, it will strengthen you, and it will make your opponents and your enemies look even more like fools than they already are.
That's a good point. It's funny to think about taking on the ironical, sort of snarky position, I guess, would have saved them. But I mean, I can only imagine, how large is this chapter of Moms of Liberty? Is it like 20 women?
That's a great question. I mean, there is always this, they turn this stuff into the sort of archetypal. It's as if they're sort of marching across Potsdamer Platz, like, in their masses, in their thousands. Of course, the power belongs to the people they're fighting. Like, this is not some terrifying, what would be the female version of a Männerbund, like a Frauenbund. This is like not what we're looking at. And
it may be a small number of women here, but as Adolf Hitler once said, well-behaved women rarely make history.
Yes, exactly. I think it was exactly. He who said Kinder Kuckuck, right? That these women should be sent back immediately to bake things and go to church. Yeah, I mean, the absurdism of it is definitely, like, it seems like the only way out. That was why I was a little sad to see that they had apologized. I mean, even just the text of the apology, like, it basically amounts to saying, like, we think Hitler is bad, and it's very bad to be Hitler, and we really apologize because Hitler is very bad. It's like, did anybody alive in sincerity and deep in their heart, if you ask, think that Page from the Indiana chapter, from the Hamilton chapter of Moms for Liberty, was sitting around thinking like Hitler had some good ideas, like that seems like a really good plan. Anyway, okay, heightening the absurdity and the contradictions, our only way out here. Let us turn now to issues of technology, and trust. Not totally unrelated to the conversation we were having about, having to watch your step if you're the wrong kind of person saying the wrong kind of thing. But we wanted to talk about a kind of a series of stories, a trend that seems to be emerging of using screenshotted private messages, whether in group chats or in direct text threads or DMs or whatever, to condemn somebody in public in various ways. The two examples that came most immediately to my mind were, one, Pedro Gonzalez, who's written for The American Mind before and who's been the object of some, hit pieces about his attitude toward Jews specifically, but just generally his use of this kind of physiognomy trope to dunk on people online. And a bunch of people from one of his old group chats that are these, if you're not terminally online like the rest of us, these are these private message boards groups where you get on Signal or Telegram or some other encrypted service and you gather a few like-minded friends to say the things that you wouldn't want to necessarily just be tweeting about, or even just to have conversations about what's going on in the world. And famously, it kind of part of the point of these groups is to have the privacy of a closed loop, a closed circuit. You're not supposed to go around saying, well, like I heard from this guy in this group chat or whatever. Obviously, this kind of confidentiality is broken all the time in various ways, but this was a particularly splashy one where they pulled up from Pedro's messages a bunch of nasty things he had said about Jewish people in general, that like as a individually they could be good, but as a group they should be problematic. They could be problematic. Pedro then said this was a dark time in my life. I went down a kind of nasty rabbit hole. I don't think this anymore. And the reason that these screenshots are being taken and used against me is because I'm not a Trumpist, because I've sort of departed from the Trump camp and now I'm being pilloried for that. There's like a kind of character assassination going on. The other story that came to mind in connection with this, weirdly, is not political in any direct way, but has to do with the celebrity Jonah Hill, whose ex-girlfriend has screenshot and spread around a bunch of direct messages he sent to her about his quote-unquote boundaries, the sort of things that he really didn't want to see her doing if they were going to be in a relationship. They included, having quote-unquote inappropriate friendships with other men, posting sexy photos, modeling. And basically the framing of this was like, if that brings you joy, if you want to do that, that's great, but I'm not about it. So you do you, and we won't be together. If you want to be with me, I want like kind of commitment and exclusivity and all these things. This was framed as a form of abuse and paraded online and in the media as evidence of Hill's so-called toxicity. Without delving too deeply into like whether you're on Jonah Hill's side or whatever, I did want to raise this trend, which is not limited to these two cases, but does seem to have made its appearance in a big way in the lead up, let's say, to what's sure to be a rancorous 2024 presidential fight, that there's a new kind of weapon now in people's arsenal when it comes to character assassination, and that is the betrayal of supposed online trust, the use of confidential messages to kind of reveal the stuff that goes on behind supposedly closed internet doors. It's clear, especially given what kind of Pedro said in response to his brush with this phenomenon, it's clear that this is going to become kind of a thing, or at least a lingering possibility as Trump DeSantis heats up. A lot of stuff that's been going on these, almost 8 years since Trump has happened in these kind of private forums as public censoriousness, cancel culture has gotten more and more intense. People have taken these conversations into smaller settings. Usually they have some sort of rule about not screenshotting. Often the messages are deleted after a certain period of time. But be that as it may, ultimately the buck stops with whether you trust the circle that you're in. And there's probably going to be more of this sort of thing. And I wanted to open up a conversation between us about like what the knock-on effects are for that, not necessarily just in politics, but in people's like psyches and social lives. What do you think that this portends for our increasingly digital world?
Well, regarding the Jonah Hill thing, it seemed like Me Too taken to some kind of absurd end.
Right.
Where his complaints about her, it was described as emotional abuse and gaslighting and some kind of, Handmaid's Tale style suppression of femininity. But I don't know. It struck. I mean, I imagine people were into it just for the salacious aspect, and laughing at his kind of pretense to respectability in their relationship or whatever it was, but it seemed entirely inoffensive.
Well, I don't think that's an attraction that's necessarily lacking from the politics either, right? To getting to look in on people's just like unguarded moments, right? That in itself is sort of, we have this.
Okay, well, there was a similar thing. It just occurred to me like a couple months ago with Steven Crowder, right? Video was released of him berating his pregnant wife. And I didn't really pay that much attention to it, but it did seem like he was, being a little bit he was being pretty obnoxious, if not outright abusive, like refusing.
Yeah, that was abuse for what I could see.
Yeah, refusing to let her use the car and just being obnoxious. The Jonah Hill thing just seemed totally. He was saying, "Look, I'd prefer it if you don't wear really tiny bikinis and put pictures of it on Snapchat. And like, if we're a couple, then let's just." Have certain boundaries or whatever. I thought it was funny that became that they tried to present that as toxic masculinity, whereas it just seemed like, a reasonable request. The Pedro stuff, look, I mean, yeah, it's not nice to release texts in that were conducted in confidence. I mean, it sounds like what he was saying was pretty awful. But I wouldn't want my private texts with people revealed to the world either. So I don't know what it says about society at large, except like, I don't know, like they said when I went to work for AIG, I guess they said don't write down anything you wouldn't want to see on the front page of the newspaper.
Right.
I mean, I violate that all the time, but still, I guess it's probably good advice.
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of a distinction. This is why I wanted to consider all these things together. Is like there's sort of a distinction to be made between the content of the thing revealed and the mode of its revelation. Like, I agree, the Pedro texts made me super queasy, and it's definitely not the sort of thing you want to see. You're like, if a friend of mine said that to me, I would like I hope that I would like smack him upside the head. But that's sort of distinct from, okay, the rule of the game is supposed to be, this is, the group chat is where we say our unsayable, unthinkable things. And obviously, increasingly, it's not like nowhere written is where you say your unthinkable things, and digital stuff is, recorded or recordable and written down. So even your private communications in digital world are at least liable to being splashed on the front page. So to me, it just kind of raises this question after you've talked about like what is good or bad similarly with Crowder, right? Like, I think that's appalling, reprehensible behavior. But like, also, where is the place where if you want to even float or raise the thought that you have that sounds bad. Like, where do you put that? Do you just like never utter it except in the confines of your own head? Like, now that we're talking, I'm thinking also about the Tucker Carlson thing where he was texting somebody about how he saw, you know, some sort of violence in the street and thought like this is not how white people would behave or something, and immediately condemned himself for even thinking that, but was confiding to his friend that that's a thought that passed through his head. It's like, well, okay, so if the rules are literally like, this thought is so incendiary, so evil that it may not exit your person at all. It's hard to know just like how, maybe this is the point, like it's hard to know where your intimacy and your confidentiality and your just private life is supposed to go.
Yeah, well, I was going to say this in the previous segment, and so I will say it now.
Don't let that stop you.
This is a moment when apologies are like ritually demanded from people for saying any number of things, but in which an apology is not really desired and forgiveness is not on offer. There's a parallel universe we can imagine in which all of us were just as hyperventilating about like calling people out for saying things that are not the very best things that could ever be said. And then the person would sort of ritually go like, yes, that was a subpar remark, and for that I am deeply sorry. And then the chorus would come back, oh, thank you. You were forgiven, onward and upward. But that is not the universe that we live in. We live in a universe where the victim is to be exposed, berated, humiliated, to the point where they beg for forgiveness, and then forgiveness is withheld. And it doesn't have to be that way. And it's sort of curious to like sort of consider, well, why isn't it that way? Is it not that way for ideological reasons? Is it that way because of partisan warfare? Or is it maybe for deeper reasons than that? And so I look at these two superficially unrelated examples, which you wisely tied together, Spencer. And, in the case of Jonah Hill, like, yeah, there were some allegations of actual conduct. And yeah, that wouldn't be terribly surprising because after all, like this is Hollywood and this is LA and this is America 2023. And, if you watch something like Maniac, the brilliant TV miniseries, and you soak in Jonah Hill's incredibly moving and pained performance, if you're anything like me, you'll come away from that viewing experience going like, someone who is capable of turning in this kind of performance as an artist is probably not at peace with themselves off screen. And so it's not terribly surprising to hear the allegations. It's easy to imagine how they could be true, but what is striking about the controversy surrounding Jonah Hill is that we have really sort of like effaced the boundary between words and deeds. And this is like a very dangerous and curious thing. So in many situations now, like saying something bad is equated morally with doing something bad. That, the weight, the moral weight on the scales of cosmic justice of words is considered to be just as great, if not greater, than that of deeds. And I'm sorry to say that this unnatural and illegitimate phenomenon is really showing forth in the controversy surrounding the doxing or the leaking of Pedro. Here we have some bad things that were said, and here we have a chorus of outrage, and here we have an apology, and here we have the withholding of forgiveness. Of course, there's a separate group of people who, I must point out, said privately Oh yes, it's a political hit job, opportunist, and has it really had an effect? Like is anything come of this? Various people with whom I spoke, who are pretty close watchers of elections and campaigns, political events, insider types, sort of didn't get it. They're like, "Oh, did anything happen as a result of that?" So there were some who were totally out to lunch on this, and out to lunch on it because it did not, I think, have the intended effect, which was to try to get a kill shot in on the DeSantis campaign and instill a sense of dread among DeSantis staffers or allies or whatever. But by and large, the energy surrounding these disclosures was one that took the bad words to be somehow worse than the bad actions involved in breaching the trust and revealing the bad words. We should be very clear. And I think people on the inside of this know what I'm about to say to be quite true. This is a fundamental violation of the most basic code of human to human trust and decency that remains on the internet. One does not simply screenshot and post or sell or shop private chats. It simply must not be done. Once you cross that Rubicon, you have done something that transcends Machiavellianism, that transcends opportunism, that crosses over, I, for one, will say, into the demonic. This is really bad stuff. This is like secret police, wet dream material. And once you cross that Rubicon, there is no going back. And for years, folks on the right have very justifiably complained that this is the sort of thing that the left does. Character assassination, mob, vigilante justice, mobs on the internet, cancellation, defenestration, character assassination, destroying people, violating the most basic tenets of privacy. And yes, it is true. If you don't want it to be in the public prints, don't say it. Don't do it. Barack Obama, our former president, if you don't want something to become public, don't put it in an email. This is common sense. This is common decency. This is this basic spiritual wisdom of, gosh, if you feel hatred burning in your breast for someone or some group of people, perhaps just take a minute to address that instead of giving voice to it. Giving voice to things is very powerful. And those powers can obviously be used in destructive ways, without question. But saying bad things is not worse than doing bad things. And I might go so far as to venture to say that doing bad things is inherently worse and more damaging and destructive than saying bad things. So the conduct that has been visited upon not just Pedro, but the wider sort of political sphere that we are in, is a seriously bad thing. And the fact that it had so little of an effect on the broader sphere, other than to make a lot of people scratch their heads and say, wow, that was gross. Don't do that. That should be a massive rebuke to whoever thought that this was a good idea or justified in some way. I have no doubt that Pedro is suffering many consequences as a result of all this. But in addition to being extremely wicked and destructive to what few scraps of honor are left on the internet, these disclosures did not have the intended effect. They did not blow up the DeSantis campaign. They did not frighten people away from the DeSantis campaign. I hope that whoever masterminded this really takes a moment to think good and hard down to the core of their heart about the foolishness and destructiveness of the decision they made, and never do so again. It's just, we cannot live this way. And no matter how many political points you might score as a member of whatever campaign, this needs to be a red line, and it needs to be reestablished. End rant.
Yeah, I would agree. It's funny what you said about the difference between words and deeds. And it reminds me, of another example of this sort of thing that came out in the media in the last week or so, involving this like really annoying and extremely cringy entertainer who I think is mostly popular among, I don't know, little girls.
And me. And me.
Oh, okay.
Colleen Ballinger, is that you're
sort of
about?
and like theater geeks, theater nerds, I guess. Colleen Ballinger, this mom who has a character. It's supposed to be like a stereotypical theater geek or music nerd, called Miranda Sings. I mean, she was very popular. Well, recently, I don't know, some texts she sent to her fans, various emails or communications she had with them, some minors came out. And I mean, I gather over the years, she's had hundreds, if not thousands, of such interactions. And people are claiming, oh, she's a groomer. She's grooming kids because, I don't know, like she would talk about asking some 14-year-old girl if she'd had her first kiss. I don't really know what it was. But all of a sudden, this woman who was, sort of like this wholesome style entertainer is now being characterized as essentially like a child pornographer. I mean, is that right, Spencer? I mean, have you been with this?
Yeah. Okay. So Miranda Sings, for those of you that were around during this particular micro era of the internet, watching YouTube in the school computer lab at lunch during middle school or whatever, Miranda Sings was the alter ego of Colleen Ballinger. She put on really bad lipstick, and she did this pretty funny routine where she would pretend to be just terrible in this very specific way at singing, and also pretend to think that she was amazing. And it was just an incredibly precise depiction of a certain kind of theater kid that imagines him or herself to really be top notch and actually totally sucks, and no one quite knows how to tell him. So you can imagine why this was catnip to me for all sorts of reasons. But even I was not able to really just penetrate the dark recesses of this particular scandal because it was so complicated. But it did seem as if, she had gotten into a form of relationship, not romantic relationship, but just sort of friendship of some kind with maybe underage people. And it was very recognizable to me, not in its more like inappropriate elements, but just in this sort of conspiratorial, confiding tone that she felt tempted to take with her fans. Because like, it is true that if you have any sort of presence on the internet, people reach out to you and they bring you like, oh, I was really affected by this, or like, I feel this way or that. And I have to say, it always feels very inappropriate if the person is like a kid, or like you just want to, you enter into this kind of thing that you really want to be cautious about. And that like when people are in actual positions of authority over young people as teachers or camp counselors or whatever, they go through all this training to make sure that they don't, ask the kid inappropriate questions, or even in a well-meaning way, like broach, tender subjects that would be better broached by their parents. And so she seems to have like really fallen afoul of that, in part because she wasn't somebody who was trained in that way. She's just a person that did a funny thing on the internet, and then all these people like loaded all of these expectations onto her and wanted her to be their like cool older sister or whatever. Anyway, I don't remember enough about the particular messages to say whether I think this was like wrong or not. But it was again a situation where the internet creates this sense of like intimacy and protection and all this stuff, which ultimately, in part because of the like scapegoating dynamic that James is talking about, really turns out to be quite fragile. And the forgiveness thing is so important because it creates this scenario having no possibility for real forgiveness creates this scenario where like everyone's role in the drama is kind of already pre-assigned. I felt this way with Pedro. I even felt this way with Crowder, although I think like some people did sort of, who had been sort of on his side, did change their minds with that one because it was so egregious. But like,
Change my mind.
What's that? Yeah, hashtag change my mind. Oof, rough times. Yeah, exactly. But like, it does sort of feel as if
I'm not a scumbag. Change my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, my wife should grovel at my feet even when pregnant with our twins. Changing my mind. Yeah, like I don't know, the feeling of being kind of trapped in these performative allegiances that it makes it impossible, either to apologize well and rightly, or to accept or believe an apology is basically, what locks us into these stalemates. And it does sort of seem like, the the upshot is just like total kind of, I always think about how in hell, in Dante's hell, everything is not actually burning, it's frozen. And that's because like in the medieval consciousness, right, God is the source of all motion and light and heat and just like all life essentially. And so it followed for Dante that in hell there would be a total absence of all of those things, no mobility. Like everybody would be trapped, and even their tears would sort of trap them further. And it's kind of dark, but like that is what I see in these like Girardian scapegoat cycles, where it's like each one just kind of immobilizes us more, and there's really no way out except to say, okay, well, if you did something wrong, apologize and then accept the apology. I mean, that's, it's hard to find. I guess what I'm saying is like grace is the only thing that breaks you out of hell, but for grace you have to make and receive sincere apologies.
Let me add one thing that I also was going to say earlier, but I will say it now. Jonah Hill's list of requirements for his relationship boundaries. It's like, what is it really? You're not letting like a girl on the internet like do what she wants. Well, maybe, but another way of considering this puzzle is to realize that it's not just women, but it's conspicuously women, young women, are more or less like brainwashed to want a relationship with the Borg, with this disincarnate swarm of fans or influencers or whatever brands, and to put that relationship above their relationship with their primary romantic partner or whatever you want to call them. Jonah Hill is very unlike most American men in a number of ways, I think. But one way in which he is very similar to millions of American men is he has to compete for the affections of his like girlfriend with the internet, with this cyborg monstrosity of a million faces, with Legion. This girl wanted, she wasn't like trying to meet other guys or whatever. She was trying to have a loving relationship with the swarm, sharing photos, presenting herself in a certain way. Like that was her primary relationship. And what he was saying was, actually, like, I would like to be that. This is like a real challenge, especially people, and again, not just girls, but it does seem obvious. Just look at pornography, look at the history of the human race. Like there is a vulnerability here, and many men, it's not really a problem for them. They have other problems characteristic of men. But we are producing generations that look upon the internet as their source of their primary relationship, the relationship that is the most intimate to them and defines their identity. One man stands up and says, like, "This is I'm not going to participate in that," and an avalanche of bullshit descends on this person. That's more than a warning sign. That is a house on fire. No doubt this point will get totally lost in the barrage of claims and counterclaims involving Jonah Hill's personal behavior and choice of words. But it should not. And at least we can do our part on this podcast to keep the focus where perhaps the focus ought to be.
I mean, such an important point. And there's something to add there about, like, we don't have the whole point of screenshots and clips and stuff on the internet is that you never have the full context. You don't know, like, what conversation they were having that led up to this, the offending text. But part of the striking thing, it seems, about how Jonah Hill's requests were framed, people pointed out they're sort of framed in this therapy talk. These are my boundaries. If this brings you joy, whatever, respect, yada, yada. But the other thing about it that struck me is, like, this was a list of, to me, quite legitimate requirements that you might have of somebody if you were in a relationship with them, that you wanted, like, their exclusive attention. And also, like, if you don't want that, God bless, but go somewhere else. And the kind of unspoken part of that is, well, look, what is a relationship? It's not actually a list of demands that we make to each other, but a list of, like, parts of ourselves that we share with one another. So presumably the unspoken, like, flip side of what Hill is saying is, like, you offer, if you want to and are ready to offer me all of these, like, levels of intimacy and exclusivity, then, like, I too will belong to you. And in fact, we will belong to one another and be one another's kind of primary touchstone of satisfaction, fulfillment, intimacy, safety. And, like, letting things in that will threaten that is just inherently kind of compromising to even the nature of what we're trying to build and do together. And this is, like, the breakdown of that contract is why so-called, like, ethical non-monogamy and all this, like, being a slut and don't slut shame me and all of that, like, that becomes popular and it feeds into this girl's reaction, I think, when you stop thinking about relationships as a sort of shared intimacy and start thinking about them as a market transaction, right? Like, what do you get from me? What do I get from you? And in some ways, it felt like Jonah Hill, or just, like, people in general, men perhaps especially, like, don't know how to make that ask. Like, not these are my requirements, but, like, this is sort of the home that we're going to create together, the emotional island that we're going to create together in an ocean of sort of devouring chaos. And, like, it's heartening to me that more and more, like, young people, trad wives, whatever, new right people are sort of discovering anew almost that it's actually way better and more rewarding to create that, like, island of security against the world between two people. But it also is, like, the reason they have to rediscover it is because it was totally dissolved in the acid bath of, like, hyper liberalism and second wave feminism. And so, like, part of the tragedy of that exchange to me was also just that, like, Hill didn't seem to have the language for framing this in any other terms than sort of this, like, ethical therapy speak about what you get and what I get and what brings me joy. I want to leave some time here to just briefly touch on the creation of the app Threads. So let's do that now. Not too long ago, Mark Zuckerberg's Meta, which owns Instagram, and this is a kind of giant empire of his, launched an app called Threads, which is tied to your Instagram, but unlike Instagram, is text-based and kind of a microblogging site. Conspicuously, this occurred shortly after Elon Musk said on Twitter that people were going to be limited, especially those that hadn't paid for their blue check, were going to be limited in the number of tweets they can read in a given time frame, because he's worried about data scraping and all sorts of like bot trolling that he's trying to limit. And he said this was temporary, but people reacted very negative to it. And generally, it seems like the enemies of Twitter and Musk took this as a sign of weakness and blood in the water. And so Meta did what Meta has done before and what other companies have tried to do, which is to create a lookalike app that would compete. And Threads really is, I mean, even more, I think, than Blue Sky or Truth Social or Parler or some of the other alternatives that have arisen for various other reasons. Threads really is just a copycat app. And even its name, Threads, is a kind of thing that you can already do on Twitter, namely create a thread. But unlike some of those other competitors that I mentioned, Instagram, Meta, Zuckerberg has an enormous pre-existing infrastructure to onboard millions and millions of users very quickly. That's, for instance, one of the challenges to Blue Sky, is that you have to kind of get invited and slowly join in. Now you can basically go on Threads and get, like, you know, Instagram, the Twitter. But the question now becomes, will it work? Will it endure? Is there something distinctive about Twitter that can't be ported over into Instagram? And is the Instagram / Zuck dominated model more or less friendly to what we hoped to get out of Elon, which was an actual open public square where people could talk and you wouldn't get like government censored for wrong think and wrong speak? But I'm interested to know what you guys think about the prognosis for all of this and where it might be headed.
Well, I will make this brief for oh so many reasons. No, I'm not a reporter, not a researcher. I'm in the discerning business, the business of gleaning things. This is what I believe. Mark Zuckerberg allowed himself to end up in a position coming out of 2016 where he became not just kind of the perfect scapegoat for people in power who really didn't want Donald Trump to become president, but he became a sort of like a strategic weak point, which his growing ranks of enemies on the left believed they could use to disrupt the entire right with a sort of kill shot against Zuck. A series of events unfolded which involved the destruction of Facebook through the petri dish grown Facebook whistleblower. As a result of this whistleblower, who was taken on tour in the UK and Europe by a gaggle of US and UK cronies associated with the Clinton, I almost said Clinton crime family, but that's a story for another day, and the NGO network, Omidyar and others, to impose draconian EU-style regulations on Facebook. It resulted in the application of various kinds of like lawsuits to Facebook by the government. It resulted in the public disgrace of Mark Zuckerberg as a creature of Peter Thiel and of the Trumpy right as a whole. It resulted in Facebook being so degraded as a brand that Zuckerberg decided to gamble it all on turning into Meta and the metaverse, something which it seemed like a bad idea at the time, and now the like studies are like the biggest room or whatever in the metaverse had 35 regular users, and the whole thing sucked and looked so bad. And it was because he had to scramble to figure something out, and he didn't want to have to do that. He was pushed in that direction by these political circumstances, And probably knowing that it wasn't going to work, probably knowing that he was being forced into a sort of second, tier of humiliation. His one of his head AI people quit Meta and went to work for Google, regime organ Google, attributing his departure to the Facebook whistleblower. Like layer and layer and layer of punishment for Zuck because of his role in 2016 has been just dished out, and the pain is not over yet. So here comes Threads. Well, what is Threads? Threads is yet another effort by Zuck to somehow find his way out of this tailspin and back into the good graces of the regime that set out quite mercilessly to just annihilate him as a result for what they considered to be his role in Trump becoming elected president of the United States. This is what I think is going on. I do not think it's anywhere near over. We'll see how the sort of Elon versus Zuck thing shakes out. I saw a tweet, I don't know if it was real or not, where Elon said Zuck is a cuck. Maybe this is just some more pro wrestling rhetoric going around. But Zuck is in a bad spot, and Threads, I read this as an effort to create a regime-friendly off-ramp for Zuckerberg, and an indication that he is willing to do basically whatever it takes to make the pain go away. Technically, Threads is like an Instagram sort of spin-off thing. Like I think head of Instagram or head of product for Instagram is basically the guy overseeing Threads, and there was of course an influx of state affiliated, let's say, journalists into Threads, and then he had to kind of say like, well, this is really just a place for community and like vibes, and we're not really doing like news or whatever. Probably can't have it both ways. I, for one, think the pattern is pretty clear. Your mileage may vary, but we should all stay tuned.
That's all fascinating, James, and much to consider. But I just have one follow-up question that I was hoping you would answer, and that is, given the latest picture of Zuck at his MMA, I think it's a class, looking absolutely yoked, what are your odds for Zuck or Elon winning the Coliseum Thunderdome?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the Olympian versus the Ozympian right now. That's not a fair fight, but none less than Peter Thiel once remarked that one of the things that he had learned over the course of his life in business was to not bet against Elon Musk. So watch where you lay your money.
I mean, doesn't Elon Musk still have like 40 or 50 pounds over Zuck?
I mean, listen, your guess is as good as mine. I'm not picking any dogs in this fight. I do want to. It does seem like everybody is now on Ozempic. Is that just like sort of a foregone conclusion? That stuff gives me the heebie-jeebies. But a topic for another day. For now, it's time for us to remind you to read the damn site. The website that we run is called AmericanMind.org. You can go there now if you are listening to us, but you have not encountered this website. Welcome. A trove of treasures awaits you. And every week, we like to direct you to a few pieces that we particularly liked, found particularly interesting, and that we hope you will check out or lay special emphasis upon. For me, this week, I'm less highlighting a specific article than I am drawing your attention as features editor to a feature that is starting to generate some really interesting conversation. Our assistant editor, Mike Sabo, brought to us an excerpt from Kevin Slack's book, War on the American Republic. That excerpt is called The Constitution, Citizenship, and the New Right. As usual, we invited responses, and one response came from Timon Klein called Not Just Any Rights. Klein has positive things to say about the book and about the excerpts overall, but then launches into an extended argument that Slack and conservatives more generally fail to take into account the particularity of rights discourse in the American tradition, and that it's not enough just to defend or even to invoke the generalized abstract rights of man, indistinct and sort of separate from any individual ethnos, any people with a history and tradition, but that rather the rights of Englishmen is what bears special emphasis in our Constitution, which in turn arises out of a larger, Aristotle, I think, would have called it politeia, this sort of series of traditions and interlocking folkways, marrying, being given in marriage, religious belief and practice, all that stuff. So Klein makes a forceful argument that unless we really reckon with the necessity, the kind of direct connection between our regime and its history, its European heritage, all of that, there's no getting away from the kind of ever expanding bureaucratic civil rights regime that has eaten our Constitution alive. I say that I'm drawing your attention to this feature as a whole because I understand we'll be getting a response from Kevin Slack, so you can look out for that as well. But I just think it's a complex, obviously, issue well worth pondering over and engaging with, and not only Slack's original excerpt, but Klein's response, and I imagine also Slack's response will be well worth your time to consider and grapple with. So not just any rights by Tim Klein and the whole feature that it's based on, beginning with Kevin Slack's excerpt. Seth, what do you got?
I like this piece we ran last week by a fellow named Bruce Gilley. It's called The Dangerous Case of Bandy X. Lee. Bruce Gilley is a professor at Portland State, and I guess he's been following the case of Bandy X. Lee for a while. I don't know how many people will remember, but she was one of those psychiatrists who, during the Trump years, felt emboldened to violate I guess it's called the Goldwater Rule, which proscribes psychologists and psychiatrists from diagnosing political candidates from afar, like without ever actually having talked to them, diagnosing them with various mental illnesses. And we saw a lot of this under Trump, where all these psychiatrists were like, yes, he is definitely a psychopath and a danger. Well, Bandy X. Lee was one of the main ones who was doing this. She went on TV all the time. And I gather she had some kind of adjunct professorship at Yale. And to Yale's credit, they terminated her contract. She didn't have tenure. They terminated her contract, I guess, because she was speaking out of turn on this, and she sued and lost. So Bruce Gilley does a nice job of going over the story and its implications for academic freedom and for the role of the expert and the academic in our national conversation. It's a good piece, so I would check it out.
Excellent. Yeah, that's one very well worth reading. And James, what do you got?
Well, what I've got is a piece from our recent feature on all things AI, if artificial intelligence is indeed the right moniker for these things that we were talking about. This is a piece called The Exterior Darkness by one Spencer Clavin, which I would especially recommend. They're all very good, but Spencer does not always get enough credit for his writings on this website. And so I'm going to throw him a bone here on the podcast. This piece is about a number of things. One of the things it is about is the so-called Turing test, which is seminal computer theorist Alan Turing's judgment that the best way for us to decide whether a machine can think is by the measure of whether or not it can trick us into thinking that it can think. This is like a very bizarre sort of torture to put people through, and it is just more and more staggering to me the more and more I reflect on it, that almost hardwired into like the elite or expert way of thinking about computation and the risks of computation and the power of computation is this idea that that deception is reality, that a machine that can deceive you into thinking that it is sentient, well, then that must mean that it is. This is madness. And so much of the madness that we live in today, I think, flows from, if not the Turing test itself, then the same kind of like bizarre, self-defeating philosophy that courses beneath it, and I think ultimately informed it. So sit back, pour yourself some tea, light yourself a cigar, whatever it is you like to do, and unwind with The Exterior Darkness by Spencer Cleaver.
Boy, oh boy. I'm blushing to the hilt, and I will even excuse the fact that that piece was not put out this week, because flattery, James, will get you everywhere. That's awesome. Thank you very much. I was happy with that piece, and I hope people profit from it. With that, we're going to thank you all for joining us this week on the Roundtable. If you want to know more about the stuff we do at Claremont, there's a lot of ways to do that. You can go to AmericanMind.org, as we've just discussed. You can go to ClaremontReviewOfBooks.com, and you can donate to support our work at Claremont.org/donate. We rely on the generosity and kindness of our listeners to keep the lights on, and we'll happily tip our hat to you in whatever way you think appropriate on the show, including if that means just not mentioning you at all because you want to remain anonymous. You go to Claremont.org/donate, mention in the show or in the donation notes that you like the Roundtable. That always makes us happy, and it especially makes us happy if you write a 5-star review. Those really go a long way to spreading the word about the show. You can subscribe, obviously, wherever you're listening, but it's extra helpful if you hit 5 stars and just write a little note, because that way we can grow the audience. On the other hand, if you have any criticisms whatsoever, we hope that you will keep them to yourself and not post them even in the group chat, where your wrong opinions can be screenshotted and broadcast to the world. We will feel no shame about doing that. Actually, yes, we will. We're just kidding. Okay, thanks all, as always, for listening. Thanks to our engineering crew, Jake Gannon, Logan Zeppieri, and Blaze Ebener. We will talk to you next week.